Two males crossed the Savuti riverbed at dawn. They moved in lockstep, shoulders rolling, their black manes catching the first copper light of morning like war paint. The ground beneath their paws was cracked and pale, baked to ceramic by months of drought, and every step sent tiny plumes of dust curling into the still air. They didn't crouch, they didn't scan. They walked with the terrible, unhurried confidence of creatures who had already decided that everything in front of them belonged to them. The first roar split the silence like a thunderclap. It rolled across the floodplain, shaking the dew off the dead grass, vibrating through the rib cages of every living thing within 8 kilometers. The second roar came 3 seconds later, layered on top of the first, a harmonic of raw, acoustic violence designed by millions of years of evolution to deliver a single message. We are here, and we are not leaving. Every lioness in the Sevuti pride dropped flat, ears pinned, bellies pressed into the dirt, cubs scrambled beneath their mothers. The old coalition, 2 aging males who had held this territory for nearly 3 years, lurched to their feet near the waterhole, their legs stiff, their eyes wide with the recognition of what was coming. Every animal in that pride understood the script. The old kings would fight, the old kings would lose. The new males would kill the cubs, the females would submit, the cycle would reset. It had happened 1,000 times across 1,000 territories since the Pleistocene. Every lioness understood that script. Every lioness obeyed it. Except one. She didn't flatten. She didn't run. She stood on a low ridge at the eastern edge of the pride's resting area, her amber eyes tracking the 2 approaching males with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. She was mid-sized, not the dominant female, not the biggest or the strongest or the most decorated fighter in the sisterhood. She carried no visible scars of rank. Her coat was a dull, tawny gold, unremarkable. She was the kind of lioness your eye would skip over in a photograph. But she wasn't running, she was watching. And then she did something that no behavioral model in the history of lion research had a category for. She walked toward them. Not to fight, not to submit. She walked with a measured, deliberate pace along the ridgeline, angling not at the invaders, but parallel to them, placing herself in a position that was neither confrontational nor submissive. She was doing something else entirely. She was choosing. If you love stories where the real power has nothing to do with size or muscle or teeth, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. Because you are about to meet the most dangerous lioness who ever lived, and she never threw a single blow. Her designation in the field logs was F14. She was 7 years old when those 2 males crossed the riverbed. She would be 12 before anyone understood what she had been doing. By then, 4 coalitions would have risen and fallen in the Savuti territory. 4 sets of dominant males, each one convinced they had conquered this land through blood and willpower and the raw physics of violence. Each one was wrong. Because the throne of the Savuti was never taken, it was given. And F14 was the one who decided who received it. But to understand how a single lioness could engineer the political destiny of an entire territory for over a decade, you first have to understand the territory she was protecting and why it was worth more than blood. The Savuti Channel is a scar on the face of northern Botswana. It runs through the Chobe ecosystem like a severed artery, a waterway that flows and dries and flows again on a cycle that even geologists struggle to predict. When the water runs, the Savuti becomes one of the richest ecosystems on the African continent. Zebra herds flood in by the thousands. Wildebeest darken the plains in columns that stretch to the horizon. Elephants gather at the channel in numbers so dense that the ground shakes like a slow earthquake beneath their collective weight. When the water runs, Savuti is paradise. But when it dries, and it always dries, the paradise becomes a colosseum. The herbivores thin out, the waterholes shrink to puddles of black mud, and every predator within 100 kilometers begins to converge on whatever moisture remains. Hyena clans expand their borders, wild dog packs push into contested ground, and the lions, the apex holders of the territory, must defend a shrinking kingdom against enemies on every side. This is what makes Savuti different from the soft grasslands of the Mara or the sprawling theatre of the Serengeti. In Savuti, holding territory isn't a privilege, it is a war of attrition. The coalition that controls the water controls everything, and the coalition that loses it dies. This is the chessboard F14 was born onto, and from her first year of life, she was watching the game. The pride she was born into was large by Savuti standards, 11 females, a shifting roster of cubs, and at the top, the first coalition she would ever know, 2 brothers, massive, battle-hardened males in their prime who had taken the territory 3 years before F14 opened her eyes for the first time. They were good kings as kings go. They patrolled aggressively. They kept the hyena clans at a respectful distance. They sired healthy cubs. The pride was stable, fed, secure. But time is the predator that no mane can intimidate. By the time F14 was 5, the brothers were aging. Their patrols grew shorter. Their roars lost the deep resonance that once rattled the acacia bark. One of them had developed a limp, a legacy of a buffalo kick that had cracked something deep in his left hip. He could still fight, but he couldn't explode. He couldn't close distance the way a territorial male needs to when a challenger comes sprinting out of the dark. The pride felt the shift. Lions are not abstract thinkers, but they are exquisitely sensitive to the body language of power. When a dominant male limps, the females notice. When his roar thins, the hyenas notice. When his brother starts sleeping through border hours instead of patrolling, every predator in the ecosystem notices. The Savuti throne was weakening, and weakness in the wild is an invitation written in blood. F14 noticed before anyone. She had a behavior that the field teams had logged dozens of times without assigning it significance. She would leave the pride's core resting area in the late afternoon, not to hunt, not to drink, but to walk the borders. She would move along the territorial edges in a slow, methodical circuit, her nose low to the ground, reading the scent map of the territory with the precision of a forensic analyst. She catalogued every fresh marking, every fading one. She knew which scent posts the brothers were maintaining and which they had started to neglect. She was reading the fault lines of the kingdom months before they cracked. The invaders arrived on a Tuesday in the dry season. 3 young nomadic males, not brothers. 2 of them were bonded, a pair that had grown up together in a neighboring territory and had been expelled by their own pride's dominant coalition at age 4. The third was an outsider, a loner who had attached himself to the pair out of the simple survival math that says 3 males live longer than 1. They were young, reckless, loud. They announced their presence with a marathon of roaring that lasted from dusk until dawn, a 12-hour acoustic assault that echoed off the sandstone ridges and turned the Savuti night into a war drum. The aging brothers answered with their own roars, but the contrast was devastating. The old roars were thin, papery. The new roars were deep and layered, vibrating at frequencies that shook the air itself. Every lioness in the pride heard the difference, and every lioness understood what it meant. The confrontation was inevitable. The old brothers met the trio at the dry riverbed on a morning when the mist still clung to the ground like smoke. It was 3 against 2, youth against experience, hunger against exhaustion. The fight was vicious, dust and blood and the wet sound of canines hitting muscle. The old brothers fought hard. They fought with the desperate fury of kings who know that defeat means exile and exile means death. But the math was merciless. 3 young bodies against 2 broken ones. The old coalition cracked within minutes. One brother took a bite to the spine that dropped his hindquarters. He dragged himself away, snarling. The other, the one with the bad hip, simply stopped fighting. He stood there, sides heaving, blood running from a gash above his eye, and then he turned and walked away. Not running, just leaving. The dignity of a king who knows the crown has been taken. The pride erupted into chaos. Females scattered, cubs squealed. The three nomads stood panting over the battlefield, drunk on adrenaline and testosterone, surveying their new kingdom. But on the eastern ridge, F-14 hadn't moved. She had watched the entire confrontation from her elevated position with the stillness of a predator observing prey. Not the males, not the fight. She was watching the three victors. Specifically, she was watching how they moved relative to each other. Two of them stood close, flanks almost touching, breathing in rhythm. The third stood apart, slightly behind, his head lower, his posture a fraction less confident. She saw the fracture. She saw the fault line within the new coalition before they even knew it existed. And in that moment, standing on the ridge while the dust of the old kingdom settled below her, F-14 made her first move. She began walking down the slope, not toward the outsider, toward the bonded pair. The pride was about to change hands. Every other lioness was preparing to endure whatever came next. F-14 was preparing to decide what came next. The dust of the old kingdom hadn't even settled before the killing began. The three nomads moved through the pride with mechanical efficiency on the first morning of their reign. They didn't roar, they didn't posture. They simply walked through the resting area with their noses low, sniffing every cub they encountered, reading the genetic signature embedded in each small body. Not mine, not mine, not mine. Every cub carried the scent of the fallen brothers, and that scent was a death warrant. The first cub died before the sun cleared the tree line. A female, barely 4 months old, snatched from behind a termite mound where her mother had hidden her. The killing was quick, a single bite to the skull. The sound was small, almost nothing, but it rippled through the pride like a shockwave. The mother lunged, snapping and snarling, but two of the males blocked her path with a wall of muscle and teeth. She retreated. She had no choice. Biology had written these rules long before she was born, and biology does not negotiate. By midday, 3 cubs were dead. 2 more were missing, likely dragged into the bush by their mothers in a desperate gamble to hide them in the thickets until the bloodlust passed. It wouldn't pass. The males would find them. They always did. The scent of milk is impossible to hide from a nose that can detect blood from 5 kilometers away. The pride was fracturing under the weight of grief and terror. Females huddled in clusters, grooming each other with obsessive urgency, a displacement behavior that said more about their stress than any vocalization could. The hierarchy that had been stable for 3 years was dissolving. Dominant females snapped at subordinates, subordinates cowered. The social architecture of the pride was collapsing into raw survival math. And through all of it, F-14 moved like smoke. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't hidden her cubs. She didn't have any. Her last litter had been lost to a hyena raid 4 months earlier, a tragedy that, in the arithmetic of this moment, had become an invisible advantage. She carried no milk scent. She triggered no infanticidal drive in the new males. She was, to them, a neutral body, unremarkable, unthreatening, invisible. But she was not passive. She was circling the pride in slow, deliberate loops, her path tracing the edges of the social chaos with surgical precision. She moved close to the 3 males, but never too close. She passed through their scent trails, absorbing information. She watched how they ate. She watched how they rested. She watched the micro-negotiations of dominance that played out in the angle of a head, the height of a tail, the willingness to hold eye contact. And she saw the crack. The 2 bonded males, the pair that had grown up together, operated as a single organism. When one moved, the other adjusted. When one ate, the other stood guard. Their coordination was seamless, built on years of shared hunts, shared fights, shared survival. They trusted each other the way only animals forged in mutual dependence can trust. The third male trusted no one, and no one trusted him. He was bigger than either of the bonded pair individually. His mane was thicker, his shoulders wider, his canines longer by a visible margin. On paper, on the raw metrics of mass and weaponry, he was the most dangerous animal in the territory. But size without alliance is a lonely currency in lion politics. He ate after the pair had finished. He slept on the periphery. When the three of them patrolled, he walked 10 meters behind, close enough to benefit from the coalition's strength, but far enough to signal that he was not truly part of it. He was a satellite, orbiting the partnership but never integrated into it. F-14 saw this the way a vulture sees a limp. She recognized structural weakness with an instinct so finely tuned it looked like intelligence because it was intelligence. Not the kind measured in puzzles or tests, but the kind that reads the invisible power lines connecting every animal in a social group and understands which lines are taut and which are fraying. She made her first move on the third night. The Pride had made a kill, a young buffalo taken down by 4 of the senior females in a coordinated ambush near the drying channel. The carcass was dragged to the open ground near the waterhole, and the feeding hierarchy immediately asserted itself. The bonded pair moved in first, shouldering each other with casual familiarity, tearing into the belly cavity with the efficiency of animals who had shared 1,000 meals. The third male approached from the south, his head low, his posture a careful balance between assertiveness and deference. The bonded pair let him feed, but they positioned themselves on either side of the carcass, their bodies forming a gate that he had to pass through. It was subtle. It was a reminder. You eat because we allow it. F-14 waited until the males had gorged and moved off to sleep. Then she approached the carcass. But she didn't approach from the direction of the main Pride. She circled wide, passing directly through the resting area of the bonded pair, rubbing her flank against a fallen log they had scent-marked, depositing her own scent alongside theirs. She paused near the dominant male of the pair, close enough that her tail brushed his mane. He opened one eye. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, a duration that in lion communication sits precisely on the border between acknowledgement and invitation. Then she moved on to eat. She did not go near the third male. She did not pass through his space. She did not acknowledge his existence. It was a vote, cast in the silent language of proximity and scent and body angle. And over the following days, she cast it again and again. She positioned herself near the bonded pair during rest periods, grooming in their vicinity, a behavior that signaled comfort and trust to every watching eye in the Pride. When the Pride moved to a new resting site, she moved first, and she moved toward wherever the bonded pair had settled, drawing 2 other females with her simply through the gravitational pull of her confidence. She was building a cluster, a social knot of female presence that orbited the bonded pair like a second skin. The other lionesses didn't understand what they were doing. They were responding to the oldest instinct in social mammal behavior: follow the animal who seems to know where safety is. F-14 seemed to know. She always seemed to know. So they followed. And without realizing it, they were casting their votes too. The effect on the third male was devastating and slow. He began to find himself alone more often. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the spaces around him emptied by degrees. Where once a female or 2 might rest within 10 meters of his position, now there was dust. Where once he could approach the kill and find room, now the carcass was surrounded by the bonded pair and a knot of females whose body language said, occupied. His share of the food decreased, not because anyone attacked him, but because access to the Pride was narrowing around him like a closing fist. He started roaring more at night, long, solitary calls that boomed across the floodplain, answered only by the distant cackle of hyenas. The bonded pair roared together, their voices harmonizing in a duet that advertised strength and partnership. His solo voice, no matter how deep, sounded thin by comparison. One voice against 2 is not a display of power, it is an advertisement of isolation. Within 6 weeks, he began to drift. His patrols took him farther from the Pride's core. He spent nights on the territorial border, a no-man's land where the scent of rival prides lingered like a warning. He was still technically part of the coalition, but the bonds were stretching to the breaking point. F-14 delivered the final push without lifting a paw. She came into estrus, The timing may have been coincidence. It may have been something deeper, something wired into the neuroendocrine feedback loops that connect social environment to reproductive physiology. Stress delays estrus. Safety accelerates it. F-14 had positioned herself in the safest zone in the Pride, the orbit of the strongest alliance, and her body had responded accordingly. She presented herself to the dominant male of the bonded pair, not subtly. She rolled in front of him, she flicked her tail, she vocalized with the low, persistent, moaning call that signals receptivity. He responded. They mated over the course of 3 days, a conspicuous, noisy affair that broadcast a single, unmistakable message to every animal in the territory. She had chosen. The Pride had chosen. The bonded pair were the kings. The third male left on the 4th morning. He walked south without looking back, his massive frame shrinking against the golden grass until he was just a dark smudge on the horizon, and then nothing at all. No fight, no dramatic confrontation. He simply read the social ledger and understood that his account was empty. There was nothing left for him here. The Savuti territory now belonged to 2 males instead of 3. A tighter coalition, a more stable partnership, less internal competition for food and mating rights, less volatility, less risk of the kind of intra-coalition conflict that could fracture a pride and leave cubs vulnerable. F-14 had engineered the outcome without a single act of aggression. She had used nothing but proximity, timing, and the ancient social calculus that governs who belongs and who doesn't. She had selected for stability over raw power, partnership over size, predictability over chaos. The bonded pair would rule the Sevuti for nearly 3 years. It was a golden era. Cub survival rates climbed. The Pride's territory expanded slightly as the confident pair pushed the borders outward. The hyena clans retreated to the margins. F-14 bore 2 litters during this period, raising 4 cubs to sub-adulthood, an extraordinary success rate in a landscape where half of all cubs die before their first birthday. She had gambled on the right kings, and the kingdom had flourished. But kingdoms don't last. They never last. The bonded pair grew older, their patrols shortened, their roars thinned, and on the borders of the Savuti, new shapes began to appear in the tall grass. Young males, hungry males, males with black manes and fresh scars, and the restless, calculating eyes of animals who smelled weakness on the wind. The cycle was beginning again. The throne was softening. And somewhere in the Pride, F-14 lifted her head from the dust, her amber eyes narrowing toward the southern border. She had done this before. She knew the steps. But this time, the board was more complicated. This time, there were more players. And this time, the wrong choice wouldn't just cost her cubs. It could cost her everything. The third coalition announced itself not with roars, but with silence. That was the first sign that this transition would be different. The usual prelude to a takeover is noise. Days of border roaring, scent wars fought in urine and claw marks on fallen trees, the slow escalation of acoustic threats that gives the ruling males time to prepare or flee. It is the etiquette of violence, a warning system that benefits both sides by allowing the weaker party to retreat before blood is spilled. The new males skipped the etiquette entirely. They came from the east, from the deep bush beyond the sandstone ridges where the Savuti Channel disappears into a labyrinth of dried oxbow lakes and mopane forest. 2 of them, brothers again, leaner than the bonded pair they were about to displace, built for speed rather than siege, with the narrow hips and long legs of males who had spent years running rather than ruling. Their manes were short and ragged, still filling in, which meant they were young, 5 years old at most. But their eyes carried the flat, cold focus of animals who had already killed to survive and found that they were good at it. They hit the territory at night. No roaring, no scent marking. They simply materialized at the waterhole where the bonded pair had been drinking, appearing out of the darkness like a hallucination made of muscle and teeth. The bonded pair never had a chance to coordinate. The fight was ambush warfare. The brothers struck the dominant male first, both of them converging on him from opposite angles, while his partner was still 40 meters away, drinking with his head down. The dominant male roared, a sound choked with shock, and tried to pivot to face both attackers at once. Impossible geometry. One brother hit him from the left, teeth sinking into the heavy mane, searching for the throat beneath the armor of hair. The other raked his hindquarters, opening 4 parallel trenches in the skin of his flank. By the time his partner arrived, galloping through the dark with his own roar shaking the ground, the dominant male was already down. Not dead, but broken. His right shoulder had been dislocated or shattered. He dragged himself sideways, snarling, but the fire was gone. The second male of the bonded pair charged in and collided with one of the brothers in a tangle of limbs and fury. For 30 seconds, the waterhole became a theatre of violence so intense that the hippos submerged and the crocodiles slid off the bank into deeper water. But the second male was fighting alone, 1 against 2, and the brothers had the synchronization of animals who had rehearsed this dance 100 times in the proving grounds of the bush. They dismantled him with terrifying efficiency. 1 pinned, 1 bit. They rotated, they adjusted. They fought like a single organism with 4 legs and 2 sets of jaws. It was over in minutes. Both males of the old coalition broke and ran, vanishing into the Mapani woodland, with blood painting their golden coats black in the moonlight. They would not return. The Eastern brothers owned the Savuti now, but they weren't alone in wanting it. 300 meters to the south, standing on the bald crest of a granite kopje, a single male watched the entire battle unfold. He was enormous, the biggest lion any animal in this territory had ever encountered. His mane was so dark it absorbed the moonlight, a halo of black that made his face look like it was floating in shadow. He was alone, no brother, no partner, no coalition at all, just mass and fury compressed into a single devastating frame. He had been circling the Sevuti for weeks, leaving scent marks on the outer boundary stones, testing the borders with exploratory roars that he issued at 3 in the morning when the ruling males were deepest in sleep. He had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, a takeover, chaos, a new coalition, still bleeding from the fight, still disorganized, still drunk on adrenaline, and not yet settled into the defensive rhythms of ownership. He could take them. Maybe. 2 young brothers against 1 massive loner. The odds were dangerous but not impossible. And the prize was the richest territory in the Chobe ecosystem. The Savuti was now caught between 2 forces. The Eastern brothers, fresh and victorious, but wounded and unfamiliar with the terrain. And the lone giant, patient and rested, but outnumbered and without allies. F-14 stood in the tall grass between the waterhole and the kopje, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, and she read both options with the calculating stillness that had become her signature. She had seen this geometry before: coalition versus loner, partnership versus raw individual power. The variables were different, but the equation was the same, and she already knew the answer. She had learned it during the first transition and confirmed it during the second. A bonded pair holds territory longer than a single male. A single male, no matter how large, is 1 injury away from collapse. 1 infected wound, 1 torn ligament, 1 unlucky kick from a buffalo. And then the territory has no defender at all, and the pride is exposed to the next wave of nomads, and the cycle of killing begins again before the cubs have had time to grow. Stability. That was the variable F-14 optimized for. Not strength, not dominance, stability. She chose the brothers. The method was the same architecture she had used before, but refined, sharpened by repetition into something that moved with the precision of instinct. She began with proximity. Within hours of the brothers' victory, while the other lionesses were still scattered and hiding, F-14 approached the waterhole. She moved slowly, her posture low but not submissive. She carried a fresh impala haunch in her jaws, a kill she had made alone in the grey light of early morning. She dropped it 30 meters from where the brothers were resting, licking their wounds. She didn't approach further. She didn't need to. The scent of fresh meat reached them within seconds. The dominant brother lifted his head, his nostrils flaring. He stood, stiff-legged, still riding the paranoia of a new territory holder who sees threats in every shadow. He approached the kill. He ate. His brother joined him. F-14 sat at a respectful distance and watched them feed on her offering. In the economy of lion social behavior, this was not a small gesture. A female bringing food to a male is an inversion of the usual dynamic. Males take, females provide. But in the chaos of a fresh takeover, when the new males know nothing about the territory, when they don't know where the water is reliable, where the prey concentrates, where the hyena dens are hidden, a female who provides is a female who has value beyond reproduction. F-14 was making herself indispensable. Over the following days, she repeated the pattern. She led the brothers to the best ambush points along the channel. Not obviously. She didn't walk up and guide them. She simply hunted in their vicinity, killing in locations that naturally drew the males deeper into the territory's richest zones. They followed the food. They followed her. And with every kill, every successful hunt that happened in their orbit, the brothers' confidence in this specific patch of earth grew. She was anchoring them, binding them to the territory through the most primal bond of all. This is where the food is. This is where you belong. The lone male on the kopje watched all of this. He saw the pride coalescing around the brothers. He saw the females gravitating toward the waterhole, toward the kills, toward the stabilizing center of gravity that F-14 was quietly constructing. Every day that passed, the brothers grew more entrenched, more familiar with the terrain, more supported by the pride's social infrastructure. The window was closing. He made his move on the 9th night. He came down from the kopje and roared. The sound was staggering, a single voice but so deep and so sustained that it seemed to come from the earth itself, a geological event rather than a biological one. The brothers roared back, their voices harmonizing, 2 against 1. The acoustic math was clear, but the lone male wasn't listening to the males. He was watching the females. He was looking for the cracks, for the lionesses who might break from the pride and follow a stronger individual signal, for the social fractures that would tell him the brotherhood's grip was weak. He found none. The pride was clustered, tight, organized around the brothers with a density that spoke of acceptance, of settlement. And at the front of that cluster, visible even in the pale moonlight, F-14 sat upright, her eyes fixed on the kopje, her body positioned between the pride and the darkness from which the roar had come. She wasn't growling, she wasn't displaying, she was simply there, a wall of presence that said, "This pride has chosen, and you are not what it chose." The lone male roared twice more. Each roar was answered by the brothers' duet. Each answer was backed by the silent weight of 8 females who did not scatter, did not flinch, did not break formation. On the 3rd night, the lone male stopped roaring. By the 5th night, his scent had faded from the border stones. He had moved on. Somewhere out in the darkness of the Chobe, he would find a weaker pride, a less organized sisterhood, a territory without an F-14 guarding the gates of succession. The Eastern brothers settled into a reign that would last 2.5 years. Stable, productive. The pride swelled. Cubs survived. The hyena clans were pushed back to the dead margins of the floodplain. F-14 raised another litter, 3 females who carried her genes and, perhaps, something less tangible into the next generation. 3 coalitions, 3 transitions. And in every single one, the same lioness had appeared at the fulcrum of the power shift, applying pressure so subtle it was invisible in the moment, but unmistakable in the pattern. She chose bonded pairs over loners. She chose stability over spectacle. She chose the coalition that would hold longest, kill fewest cubs, and give the pride the widest window of peace in which to breed and raise and strengthen. She didn't fight the kings, she didn't challenge them. She simply decided which kings got to be kings, and the ones she didn't choose vanished like smoke. But the fourth transition was already gathering on the horizon, and it would be nothing like the others. Because the fourth coalition didn't come as a pair, it came as an army. 4 males, young, massive, bound together by blood and violence, moving through the Chobe like a storm front. They had already destroyed 2 prides to the south. They killed without hesitation and without the selective restraint that smaller coalitions sometimes showed. They were not looking for a kingdom, they were looking for annihilation. And for the first time in her life, F-14 faced a board with no good moves. No fracture lines to exploit, no weak satellites to isolate. Just 4 sets of jaws and the mathematical certainty that when they arrived, cubs would die. Every instinct she had built over 3 transitions told her the same thing. There is no version of this that ends well. But F-14 had never played for the best outcome. She had always played for the least worst one. And somewhere in the chaos that was coming, in the blood and noise and grief of the fourth transition, there was a seam. A hairline crack in the coalition that not even its own members knew existed. She just had to find it before the killing started. They arrived like a plague, 4 males moving in a staggered line across the Savuti floodplain, their silhouettes cutting black shapes against the burning orange of a dry season sunset. They didn't walk in formation like brothers. They moved in a looser arrangement, each animal maintaining its own radius of space. 2 of them were brothers, thick-necked and nearly identical, with dark manes that merged into the shadows of their chests. The third was slightly smaller, lighter in color, with a torn left ear that gave his face a permanent snarl. The fourth was the largest, a pale-maned giant with a body built like a battering ram and eyes that carried the vacant, bottomless calm of an animal that had stopped feeling anything about killing a long time ago. Their roars had been rolling in from the southern border for 3 days. 4 voices braiding together into a wall of sound so dense it made the air feel heavy. 4 male roars are rare in the wild. A quartet produces a harmonic resonance that vibrates at a frequency lower than almost any other biological sound on the savanna. It doesn't just intimidate, it overwhelms. The Eastern brothers heard it. They stood at the waterhole on the first night, shoulder to shoulder, and roared back. 2 voices against 4. The inadequacy of their response hung in the air like a confession. By the second night, the brothers had stopped roaring. By the third morning, they were gone, slipped away before dawn, heading north into the Mapane woodland, choosing exile over execution. The transition was bloodless at the top, but the blood came quickly after. The 4 males spread through the pride like a toxin. They moved systematically, noses low, hunting the scent of milk. The pride was shattered. Females scattered in every direction, some carrying surviving cubs in their jaws, some simply running with no destination except away. F-14 lost 2 cubs, 2 of the 3 females she had raised under the Eastern brothers' reign. 9 months old. Old enough to run, but not old enough to outrun a full-grown male with murder encoded in his muscles. She had hidden them in a dry creek bed, tucked into a crevice beneath the exposed roots of a leadwood tree. The pale-maned giant found them by scent. F-14 arrived too late. She stood over the bodies of her daughters for 11 minutes. She didn't vocalize, she didn't pace. She stood absolutely still, her head lowered, her breathing shallow. And then she lifted her head and looked south, toward the waterhole, where the 4 males were settling into the postures of ownership. Something shifted in those amber eyes. Not grief. Grief is a luxury for animals who have time to feel it. What moved behind her gaze was something colder, more structured, the same calculating stillness that had guided her through 3 transitions, but now sharpened to a razor's edge by loss. She had one surviving cub, a female, hidden 3 kilometers north in a jackalberry thicket. That cub was the last thread of her genetic legacy. She could not afford another 3 years of chaos. But the board was impossible. 4 males, no fracture lines, no obvious weak satellite to isolate. They moved together, ate together, patrolled together, a wall without seams, or so it appeared. F-14 returned to the Pride. She was one of the first females to come back, approaching the 4 males with the same measured, neutral posture she had used in every previous transition. She sat at the edge of their awareness, and for 9 days she did nothing but watch. She watched them eat. The 2 brothers always fed first. The torn-eared male fed next. The pale-maned giant fed last, despite being the largest. Size without social priority. That was the first crack. She watched them patrol. The brothers covered the western border in efficient sweeps. The torn-eared male took the south. The giant was given the east, the quietest sector, the one with the least strategic value. He was being marginalized by his own coalition. She watched them rest. The brothers groomed each other. The torn-eared male groomed with them occasionally. The giant rested alone, always alone. His massive body curled in the shade of a distant tree, while the other 3 occupied the prime ground near the water. The crack wasn't between 2 halves. It was between 3 and 1, and the 1 was the biggest, most dangerous animal in the territory. F-14 adjusted. In previous transitions, she had starved the outsider of proximity until he drifted away. But this giant wasn't a reluctant satellite who would leave peacefully. He was a killer who had earned his place through violence. She couldn't push him out. So she pulled the other 3 in. She began with the brothers. The same architecture as before, but accelerated, compressed, urgent. She brought kills to their vicinity. She led the returning females toward their resting area. She groomed near them. She drew the Pride's center of gravity toward the trio with gravitational precision. The other females, traumatized and desperate for stability, latched onto the cluster F-14 was building with an urgency born of grief. Within 2 weeks, the Pride had reorganized itself around the trio. The brothers and the torn-eared male had a court. They had females, they had kills, they had everything a coalition needs to feel secure. The giant had nothing. He patrolled the eastern border alone, roaring into emptiness. He returned to the Pride and found no space at the kill. He approached females and they moved away, not dramatically, just a quiet, collective drift that opened distance between him and every other warm body in the territory. He was being erased, not attacked, erased. The confrontation came on a moonless night, 6 weeks after the takeover. The giant approached the brothers at the waterhole, and for the first time, his posture wasn't deferential. His head was high, his mane was bristling. He wanted what they had. The brothers met him with bared teeth. The torn-eared male flanked left, cutting off retreat. 3 against 1. The geometry was identical to every other isolation F-14 had engineered. The fight was savage. The giant launched himself at the dominant brother in a cyclone of dust and claws. The second brother hit from behind. The torn-eared male darted in, snapping at the exposed belly. It lasted 4 minutes. The giant fought with everything. He was stronger than any individual opponent. He opened wounds on all 3 attackers, but 3 is 3, and 1 is 1. The giant broke away, bleeding from a dozen gashes, his left eye swollen shut. He stood for a moment, swaying, staring at the 3 males arrayed against him. Then he turned east. He walked into the darkness. He did not look back. The Savuti belonged to 3 males now, a tighter coalition, more stable, less internal competition. The same outcome F-14 had engineered 3 times before, achieved through the same invisible machinery of proximity, timing, and the quiet redistribution of loyalty. The killing stopped. The remaining cubs survived. F-14's daughter emerged from the jackalberry thicket and was integrated into the Pride without incident. 4 coalitions, 11 years, every single transition shaped by the same unseen hand. She had never roared at a rival male, never thrown herself into a fight, never displayed the kind of dramatic, violent heroism that announces itself with noise and blood. What she had done was quieter, deeper, more dangerous than any physical confrontation because it operated on the level of social architecture itself, rearranging the foundations of power while the powerful were too busy posturing to notice. She understood something that teeth and muscle never could. The throne doesn't belong to the animal that fights the hardest, it belongs to the animal the pride follows. And she decided who the pride followed, every single time. F14 was 12 years old now, old for a Savuti lioness. Her joints were stiff in the mornings, her teeth were wearing down. The golden fire in her eyes had dimmed to a steady, patient amber. She conserved, she calculated, she watched. But she was not the only one watching anymore. Her surviving daughter had grown into a young lioness of unremarkable size and unremarkable appearance. Mid-hierarchy, quiet. The kind of lioness your eye would skip over in a photograph. But she had a habit that the other females did not share. In the late afternoons, when the rest of the pride was sleeping, she would leave the core resting area and walk the territorial borders in slow, deliberate circuits. Her nose low, her eyes cataloguing every scent mark, every fading boundary, every hairline crack in the architecture of power. She was reading the territory the way her mother had read it, not through instruction, through presence. Through 11 years of watching the quietest animal in the pride reshape the world without making a sound. The next coalition was already out there. Somewhere beyond the Mapane woodland, young males were growing restless, testing their strength, dreaming of kingdoms. They would come, as they always came, with roars and violence and the absolute conviction that they were conquering this territory through the force of their own will. They would be wrong. Because somewhere in the tall grass, a lioness would be watching, reading the fracture lines, choosing the kings. And the males who believed they had seized the Sevuti throne would never know that it had been offered to them by an animal they had barely noticed. The loudest roar doesn't rule the savannah. The quietest mind does.